First of all, remember the 2 ransom notes that came early on that went to the TV stations in Arizona? Those are the notes that we believe Savannah Guthrie was referencing when she said that she thought 2 of the notes were real and legitimate. Well, there was a Bitcoin account, and we've got some new information about a transaction in that Bitcoin account early on, and a note in the Bitcoin account specifically that seems like it's either from the FBI or from the Guthrie family.
Day 79. An 84-year-old woman still missing. A Bitcoin wallet created by her alleged kidnappers. And on February 10th, 2 months ago, someone deposited money into that account with a single message. We are ready to talk. Contact us. But here's what doesn't make sense. The response wasn't negotiation. It was silence. Complete silence. And in kidnapping investigations, silence from someone who demanded ransom isn't just unusual. According to federal analysis, it's a signal. Because if you wanted to negotiate, you would have responded to the first contact, which raises one critical question. If this wasn't about getting paid, what was it about? If you're drawn to cases where the evidence doesn't just tell a story but contradicts it, you're in the right place. This is Investigative Files, where we don't just cover true crime, we investigate it. And what you're about to hear isn't just what happened to Nancy Guthrie. It's what the investigation reveals when every answer creates a harder question. Nancy Guthrie lived in Tucson, Arizona, 84 years old. Not a public figure herself, but connected to one. Her daughter-in-law is Savannah Guthrie, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show. That connection will become important, but not in the way you might think. On a night in early January, Nancy disappeared from her home. No signs of forced entry that were immediately obvious. No clear witnesses, just absence where there had been presence. And within days, something unusual began. Ransom notes. Not one, but multiple. 2 of them sent directly to television stations in Phoenix. And according to Savannah Guthrie herself, she believed those 2 notes were real and legitimate. The notes included instructions, a Bitcoin wallet, a demand, the suggestion that if the family paid, Nancy would be returned. It looked on the surface like a kidnapping for ransom. Exactly what you'd expect when someone with a famous family member goes missing. But by day 79, Nancy Guthrie is still missing. The ransom has not been paid, and the Bitcoin wallet at the center of those early notes has been silent for nearly 2 months, which is where the investigation stops behaving like a typical kidnapping case and starts behaving like something else entirely. When reporter Brianna Whitney reviewed the Bitcoin wallet in question, she found something that hadn't been made public before. On February 10th, a small amount of money was deposited into the account. Not a ransom payment, a signal. And attached to that deposit was a message. We are ready to talk. Contact us. It included a link for how to reach out. The source of that deposit hasn't been officially confirmed. But the timing, the phrasing, the method, all of it suggests this came from either federal investigators or the Guthrie family. An attempt to open communication, to show good faith, to say, we're here, we're listening, let's negotiate. And then, nothing. No response, no follow-up demand, no proof of life, no engagement at all. The wallet went silent, and it has remained that way ever since. At first glance, this seems like a breakdown, a missed opportunity. The kind of moment that families agonize over, wondering if they should try again, should deposit more money, should send another message. But when examined through the lens of federal kidnapping protocol, the silence means something different. It's not a failure of communication, it's a confirmation. Because in ransom negotiations, there's a fundamental principle. Both sides need each other. The kidnapper needs money. The family needs their loved one back. That mutual dependency creates leverage on both sides. As one former FBI agent explained it, this isn't a situation where one party dictates terms. It's a negotiation. And if you start it by showing desperation, you lose before you begin. The February 10th deposit wasn't desperation. It was leverage. It was the FBI or the family saying, we're both in this. You want money, we want her back, so let's talk. But if you won't talk, then you're not the only option we have. Because we're your only victims. If you don't get money from us, you don't get a dime. It's a zero-sum endgame. And in that context, the lack of response to the February 10th message isn't just unusual, it's revealing. Because someone who genuinely wanted ransom money would have responded. They would have engaged, they would have negotiated, even if only to demand more or to set conditions. But they didn't. Which means one of two things. Either the people who sent those ransom notes are no longer able to respond, which raises its own set of darker questions, or they were never interested in a successful ransom negotiation in the first place. And that possibility changes everything. There's another detail that didn't sit right from the beginning. The ransom notes weren't sent through private channels. They weren't delivered to the family directly. They weren't passed through an intermediary who could facilitate quiet negotiation. They were sent to television stations, to the media, to the most public platforms available. And when you're trying to successfully negotiate a ransom, that's the last thing you do. Because once a kidnapping becomes public, it becomes exponentially harder to manage. Law enforcement gets involved at higher levels. Media attention intensifies. The family is under scrutiny. And most importantly, the negotiation itself becomes compromised because now everyone is watching. If you wanted to get a message to someone, you could choose any number of intermediaries. Attorneys, private investigators, trusted contacts. There are ways to communicate that don't involve broadcasting your demands to the public. But in this case, the method chosen was the opposite of discreet. According to investigative analysis, that choice wasn't an accident. It wasn't the result of someone who didn't know better. It was deliberate. They wanted this public. They wanted the attention. They wanted the spectacle. And that fundamentally contradicts the goal of a successful ransom. Because if your objective is to get paid and get away, you avoid visibility. You avoid creating a massive investigative footprint. You avoid giving federal agents and media outlets a roadmap to follow. But if your objective is something else, if the goal isn't money, but a message, then suddenly, the public nature of the communication makes sense. It's not a bug, it's a feature. And once you start thinking of this as a message rather than a transaction, the entire case begins to look different. Let's inventory what was done and what wasn't. The alleged kidnappers sent ransom notes. That suggests intent to negotiate, but they provided no proof of life. In standard kidnapping protocol, proof of life is one of the first things demanded by negotiators and one of the first things provided by kidnappers who want to be taken seriously. It establishes that the victim is alive and that the kidnapper actually has control. Without it, there's no basis for negotiation. They created a Bitcoin wallet. That suggests a plan for receiving payment, but they chose to communicate through television stations. That undermines operational security and makes the entire transaction traceable and public. They made a financial demand. That suggests the goal is money. But when someone deposited funds and offered to negotiate, they went silent. That suggests money wasn't actually the priority. Every single action contradicts the next. And when you step back and look at the pattern as a whole, it doesn't look like someone trying to execute a successful ransom. It looks like someone performing the idea of a ransom while actively sabotaging their own success. In investigative terms, this is called bad faith negotiation. It's when someone goes through the motions of a process but has no intention of following through. And once that pattern is identified, it reframes everything. Because if the kidnappers weren't negotiating in good faith, then the ransom demands were never the real objective. So what was? When trying to identify an unknown perpetrator, investigators often start with statistics, not because every case fits a pattern, but because patterns reveal probabilities. And probabilities guide resource allocation. In cases where women are murdered, roughly 92% of the time, the person responsible is someone they knew. Not necessarily a close friend or family member, but someone within their orbit. Someone they'd had contact with at some point. For kidnapping cases, the statistics shift slightly but follow a similar pattern. The majority of abduction victims knew their abductor in some capacity. Again, not always intimately, but there was prior contact, prior awareness, a history, even if brief. When applied to Nancy Guthrie's case, those statistics suggest something important. The person responsible is likely someone she encountered, not a stranger who randomly selected her. Not someone operating purely from a distance, but someone who had, at some point, been in her life. Now, there's a valid question about whether general statistics apply to this specific case. Kidnappings for ransom are statistically less common than other types of violence, and within that subset, the patterns might differ. But even when narrowed to kidnapping-specific data, the conclusion holds. Most victims know their abductors, which means the investigative scope isn't everyone in Tucson. It's everyone Nancy Guthrie came into contact with over a specific period of time. And based on one critical factor, her connection to Savannah Guthrie, that time period becomes even more defined. Because if the motive involves Savannah's prominence, if the perpetrator targeted Nancy because of who her daughter-in-law is, then the relevant window isn't Nancy's entire lifetime. It's the period during which Savannah became a nationally recognized media figure. That narrows the timeline to roughly 10 to 15 years, and within that window, investigators can start building a list. Contractors who worked on the house, service providers, delivery personnel, maintenance workers, anyone who had access, even briefly, anyone who would have known the layout, the routines, the vulnerabilities, anyone who might have paid attention to the fact that Nancy Guthrie's family included someone famous. It's a long list, but it's not infinite, and that makes it actionable. Surveillance footage from the night Nancy disappeared captured something. Not everything, but something. A figure, movement, behavior. And when that footage was analyzed, not just for what it showed, but for what it suggested, one word kept coming up: unafraid. The person on that video didn't move like someone improvising, didn't act like someone panicking or uncertain, moved with confidence, with purpose, like someone following a plan they'd already thought through. In behavioral analysis, confidence in the commission of a crime usually signals one of two things. Either the person has done this before, or they believe they've planned well enough that they won't get caught. And in this case, given the specificity of the targeting and the lack of prior similar incidents in the area, the latter seems more likely. This was someone who believed they had accounted for the risks, someone who thought they were smarter than the investigation that would follow. That kind of mindset has a name: overconfidence. And overconfidence, while dangerous in the moment, becomes a vulnerability over time. Because overconfident people make mistakes. They take risks they shouldn't. They leave evidence they don't realize is significant. They assume they've thought of everything when, in reality, they've missed something. According to investigative analysis, that's the hope here. That somewhere in the execution of this plan, the perpetrator's overconfidence created a crack, a small detail, a piece of evidence that didn't seem important at the time but becomes critical when examined in context. It might be something on that surveillance footage. It might be something in the forensic evidence collected from the home. It might be a pattern in behavior that only becomes visible when compared against other data. But the belief is that it's there, and that eventually, it will surface. If this wasn't about money, then what was it about? One possibility keeps emerging in the analysis: revenge, or retaliation, or some form of deeply personal grievance. Because when you look at the effort involved, the planning, the staging, the public ransom theater, it's too elaborate for a crime of opportunity. It's too personal for a random act. It feels targeted, intentional, driven by something more than financial need. There's a psychological profile that fits this pattern. Someone who becomes fixated on a public figure. Not always violently, not always with clear intent, but obsessively. They follow the person's career. They consume media about them. They build a relationship in their mind that doesn't exist in reality. And sometimes, something shifts. A perceived slight. A comment that feels personal. A belief that they've been wronged or ignored or disrespected. And that fixation turns into grievance. In cases involving media personalities, this pattern isn't uncommon. The obsessive research. The deep familiarity with the target's life and family. The sense of entitlement to their attention or their acknowledgement. And when that entitlement is frustrated, it can turn into something darker. If Nancy Guthrie was taken not for ransom, but as a way to hurt Savannah, or to send Savannah a message, then the public nature of the ransom notes makes perfect sense. Because the goal wasn't to quietly extract money. It was to make sure Savannah knew, to make sure the media knew, to make sure the message was received. And if that's the case, then the ransom itself was never meant to succeed. It was theater. part of a larger psychological operation designed to inflict maximum emotional damage, which means the investigation isn't just looking for someone who wanted money. It's looking for someone who wanted to hurt, someone with a grudge, someone who felt justified in taking an 84-year-old woman to make a point. That's a different kind of perpetrator, and it requires a different kind of investigation. Despite the complexities of motive and behavior, investigations ultimately rely on physical evidence. And in Nancy Guthrie's case, that evidence is limited but significant. Early in the investigation, forensic teams collected material from the scene. DNA samples, trace evidence, the kind of microscopic details that get left behind whenever humans interact with a physical space. And among those samples was a hair. That hair was sent to a lab in Florida that frequently works with the Pima County Sheriff's Office. Standard procedure. The goal was to extract DNA, build a profile, and potentially match it against existing databases. But recently, that hair was transferred from the Florida lab to the FBI's facility in Quantico, Virginia, for what's being described as advanced testing. The significance of that transfer isn't immediately obvious unless you understand the technical distinctions involved. Hair evidence comes in two forms. There's the shaft, the visible part of the hair, and there's the follicle, the root. If you recover a hair with the follicle attached, you get a much larger, more useful DNA sample. If you only get the shaft, the sample is smaller and harder to work with. Traditionally, hair without a follicle was considered less valuable. But technology has advanced rapidly. New extraction techniques are making it possible to pull usable DNA from hair shafts alone. It's not guaranteed. Variables like whether the hair has been chemically treated, dyed, bleached, permed, affect the success rate. But it's no longer the dead end it used to be. If the FBI lab at Quantico can extract a usable profile from that hair, the next step is genetic genealogy. This is the process that's revolutionized cold cases over the last several years. Instead of relying on a direct match in a criminal database, investigators use public genetic databases to build family trees. They identify relatives, they narrow down possibilities, and eventually they land on a name. It's not fast, it's not guaranteed, but it's possible. And in a case where traditional leads have been limited, it might be the pathway that eventually breaks this open. The challenge is patience, because eventually can mean months. And for a family waiting for answers on day 79, months can feel impossible. There's a tension in high-profile cases between what the public wants and what the investigation needs. The public wants information, details, updates, a sense that progress is being made. And families, understandably, want the same thing. They want to feel like everything possible is being done. But from an investigative standpoint, releasing information can be counterproductive. And the reasoning is twofold. First, there's the issue of prosecution. In any criminal case, there are details that only the perpetrator and the investigators know. Those details become critical during interrogation and trial. They're how you verify confessions. They're how you distinguish between someone who actually committed the crime and someone who's just claiming credit or confusing the facts. If those details are released publicly, they lose that value. Everyone knows them, which means you can't use them to confirm guilt. And in a case where evidence is already limited, protecting those details becomes even more important. Second, there's the issue of public response. In the age of social media, information spreads instantly, and not just information, interpretation, theory, accusation. When investigative details are released, people start building narratives. They start identifying suspects in their communities. They start making accusations that may or may not have any basis in reality. And when someone is wrongly accused, when their name gets attached to a theory that goes viral, it can destroy their life. Even if they're eventually cleared, the damage is done. The association lingers. So the decision to withhold information isn't about secrecy for its own sake. It's about protecting the integrity of the case and protecting innocent people from becoming collateral damage in public speculation. But that doesn't make it easier, especially for a family that's desperate for answers. Especially when the only tangible link they have, a Bitcoin wallet, went silent 2 months ago. And the question becomes, do you keep trying? Do you deposit more money, send more messages, keep reaching out in the hope that something changes? Or do you accept the assessment that the people on the other end of that wallet were never negotiating in good faith to begin with? By day 79, the reality has shifted. Not officially, not publicly, but within the investigative framework. Because when you combine the lack of proof of life, the bad faith negotiation pattern, the public communication choices, and the extended time frame, the probabilities become harder to ignore. And according to those who've worked similar cases, the chances of recovering Nancy Guthrie alive are, in their assessment, infinitely small. That doesn't mean impossible. It doesn't mean the investigation has stopped looking. But it does mean the focus has shifted, from rescue to prosecution, from hoping for the best outcome to preparing for the most likely one. And that shift changes the investigation in subtle but significant ways. Because now every piece of evidence isn't just about finding Nancy. It's about building a case against whoever took her. It's about making sure that if a suspect is identified, the evidence is strong enough to hold up in court. It's why the hair sample matters so much. It's why the financial records review continues. It's why investigators are going back 10 to 15 years through Nancy's contact history, cross-referencing names, checking backgrounds, looking for patterns. Because if Nancy can't be brought home, the next best outcome is justice. And justice requires evidence. It requires patience. It requires a case that doesn't just identify a suspect, but proves what they did. There's one question that keeps surfacing in the analysis. If the goal was simply to eliminate Nancy Guthrie, if this was about silencing her or sending a message through her absence, why this method? Because statistically, when someone is targeted for elimination, the method is direct, quick, efficient, walk in, commit the act, leave. That's the pattern in organized crime, in cartel violence, in any situation where the goal is an outcome, not a process. But this wasn't that. This was elaborate, time-consuming, high risk. It involved taking Nancy from her home, staging a kidnapping, creating ransom notes, managing a Bitcoin wallet, maintaining some level of control or concealment for an extended period. That's not the behavior of someone who just wanted her gone. That's the behavior of someone who wanted the process itself to mean something. Someone for whom the method was part of the message. And that brings the analysis back to the revenge framework. Because revenge isn't just about the outcome. It's about the suffering, the spectacle, the knowledge that the target is experiencing something. If this was revenge aimed at Savannah Guthrie, then simply harming Nancy wouldn't be enough. Savannah would need to know, would need to feel the uncertainty, the fear, the helplessness, and the ransom notes, the public communication, the extended timeline. All of that serves that purpose. It's not about the money. It's about the torment. And if that's true, then the person responsible isn't just calculating. They're cruel. So where does that leave the investigation on day 79? Active. Not cold, not stalled, but slow, methodical, operating on time frames that don't align with the urgency a family feels. The hair sample is at Quantico. The analysis is ongoing. If DNA can be extracted, if genetic genealogy produces viable leads, if a family tree can be built and narrowed, then maybe eventually there's a name. The financial records are being reviewed. 10 to 15 years of transactions. Contractors, service providers, anyone who had access. Anyone who knew about the Savannah Guthrie connection. Anyone who might fit the profile of someone obsessive enough, aggrieved enough, confident enough to plan something like this. The surveillance footage is being re-examined. The behavioral analysis continues. The profilers are building a picture not just of what happened, but of who could have made it happen. And somewhere in all of that data, in all of those records, in all of those hours of footage and years of transactions, there's a detail, a connection, a name. But it hasn't surfaced yet. And until it does, the investigation is a waiting game, which is agonizing for a family, especially when the one tangible thing they had, a Bitcoin wallet, a communication channel, a sense that someone on the other end might respond, has been silent for 2 months. And the question they're left with is the same question we're all left with. If this was never about ransom, if the goal was revenge or a message or something else entirely, then what happens now? Does the perpetrator just disappear? Do they feel satisfied that the message was sent? Or is there more to come? Because the silence from the Bitcoin wallet might not mean the end. It might just mean a shift, a new phase, something we haven't seen yet. The Nancy Guthrie case isn't solved, it's ongoing. Which means every question we've examined is still open. Every theory is still just that, a theory. Every piece of evidence is still being processed. But what the investigation has revealed, even without a resolution, is structure. Not chaos, but design. Not randomness, but intent. The ransom notes weren't a desperate attempt at negotiation. They were performance. The public communication wasn't a mistake. It was strategy. The silence following the February 10th Bitcoin deposit wasn't a breakdown. It was confirmation. And somewhere in the 10 to 15-year history of Nancy Guthrie's life, there's a person who knew her, who had access, who believed they had a reason to do this, who thought they were smart enough to get away with it. The investigation believes that person made mistakes, that overconfidence created vulnerabilities. That evidence exists, even if it hasn't been fully identified yet. And the hope, the only hope at this point, is that eventually that evidence leads somewhere. That the hair sample produces a profile. That the genetic genealogy builds a family tree. That a name emerges. Because without that, Nancy Guthrie remains missing. Her family remains in limbo. And whoever did this remains free. Day 79. And counting. If this kind of investigative depth is what you're looking for, cases where we don't just tell you what happened, but walk through the reasoning, the contradictions, the unanswered questions, then subscribe to Investigative Files. Because we're not just covering true crime, we're investigating it. And the Nancy Guthrie case is still unfolding. Which means when something breaks, when that detail finally surfaces, you'll hear about it here first. Until then, the question remains, if the ransom was never real, what was the point? And when we finally get the answer, will it be what we expected? Or will it be something we never saw coming?